whenever you're ready to.
Can I ask my question first?
Sure.
In terms of recording, since I'm taking minutes, if I needed or wanted to review our meeting, could I do that in the context of making sure the minutes are accurate and complete? Do I have an opportunity to?
Yeah, we'll get a message when the transcript is ready, and we can send a copy of that to you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's bring the meeting to order. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
So just a little, sorry to interrupt, but Zoom etiquette. It's very easy to talk over one another. What may be easier is, if you can mute yourself, if you want to say something, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. So it makes the conversation go a little bit easier and questions a lot easier to field and respond to. Peggy, you're the chair, so you don't need to be muted.
Well, I do so many of these. I think we all kind of know what etiquette is on Zooms, but let's try it. And if we have a problem, we'll start raising hands.
Okay.
Let's bring the meeting to order. And also, has everyone read Robert's minutes from the last meeting? And are we good to approve them? All in favor?
Aye.
Was there a motion to open the meeting?
So moved.
Make a motion to open the meeting. Okay, may I make a motion to open the meeting? We're getting very formal.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Minutes from our last meeting. Like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
I second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
So now we can get those posted. Dan, have you received a copy of the agenda?
I received, yeah, I have a copy of it with the 8 items on it.
Yeah, is it easier for you to go one by one in order?
Sure, I can do that for you.
We normally do.
Yeah, so first item update on a meeting that was rescheduled between Schumer, Gillibrand, and Engel. I haven't heard anything. I know obviously the world went on its head about 4 months ago. And now we also we have a new congressional representative next year.
Right.
So I don't know if that's going to be done during the transition, or maybe we can reach out to Schumer and Gillibrand's office, see where they stand on talking about this with either Engel or Kelly has a must have.
Go ahead. No, go ahead and finish, Dan.
No, so we can follow up with Gillibrand, Schumer, and Engel's office, see what the process is to see if we can start getting some momentum on this. I think they may want to see what's going to shake out with the election in November, but let's. There's no harm in asking them to see if they can get back together or what their time frame is.
I just want to add, I talked to Tom about this, and he has been in touch with them because he was hoping to attend the meeting as well. And
Right.
He's gotten crickets in reply. So he thinks it's just best to wait until January, reach out then, see what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see anything happening
No,
anywhere.
no.
I don't see anything happening. I just thought, would it be wise to reach out to Engel while he was still in office, since he was part of it, and chances are someone new coming into office, this isn't going to be high on their priority list. That was my thought.
Well, if Tom has tried to get a hold of him and he's getting crickets, I don't see that we're going to get, we're a little bit lower on the pecking order, so I don't think it'll work.
Okay.
Um,
And we'll revisit in January, because I do think we can't just let this go. We need some sort of information back.
Okay. Item number 2, I can probably get dollar damages. How far back would you like me to try and go, Peggy? I think
I think we should do 2011 and 2007.
okay.
I mean, those are two big ones.
Okay, so I will, as far as percentage of residents who had to evacuate their homes, I don't know if I'm gonna have a good answer on that one. I may see if there's some sort of metric where it's like a generally accepted number, But I mean, as far as specifics, I don't think I can get that information.
Does everyone agree with those two storms? Do we need anything else?
Hey, Dan, I wonder if it might be easier to, instead of the number of residents who evacuated, the number of residents who are under an evacuation order.
I think I don't know if we did anything in 07. I wasn't here then. 2011, I know we did do a advisory evacuation for Orienta. So that's where I get that information. I don't know what was done in 07 though.
And was that 2012 for Orienta because it was Sandy?
No, Irene was 2011.
Yeah,
And Irene was,
I'm just surprised that it was Orienta and not everywhere else.
Because it was a coastal storm, really.
yeah, I think the hurricane inundation maps are the maps that we use. I think that in general, Orienta tends to take more direct hit during coastal storms than short
Right.
clears or short acres.
That's what I'm
Because the
saying. I thought
orientation-
that would be 2012, not 11.
No, it was definitely 2011 we did that because
Hang on a sec.
Speaking on behalf of Shore Acres, we get it.
No,
well,
you get it for sure.
I know Flagler got it.
yeah,
I will tell you, 2007 in April, there was an evacuation order because my next door neighbor was ordered to evacuate and she didn't.
okay.
Question?
Sorry, Robert.
Would FEMA have a record of that information? Don't they keep records of that kind of thing? Weren't they involved?
They would have records of anything they paid out or SBA loans. They're not going to have records of people who didn't submit claims, which I think you tend to see a lot of with some of these storms because the federal reimbursement process for the average homeowner is a very onerous and imposing scenario. Is that a fair characterization, Peggy?
I actually thought they were fantastic.
Really? I know for a lot of people, it's an imposing.
Well, it was so ridiculous here that how could they be anything but?
Yeah.
But I don't think they wouldn't have the information before the damage is done, Rob. That comes out of the municipality. They take over after the storm and the damage is done.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just going to add that I've been in Orienta and had 2 evacuation orders. So I'm sure both those years there were evacuation orders.
Yeah.
I mean, Dan, whether it was you came around and forced me out of the house, no, that didn't happen. But
No, I mean, yeah,
from a residential perspective, we were told to get out.
Yeah.
Mhm. I'm sure 11 and 07 and probably part of 12 as well.
yeah, I think for Sandy, we had did the
Sure.
same evacuation.
You know what, maybe, should we be looking, and I always think of river storms, which is my fault. Should we be looking at flood damages from Sandy as well?
Well, Sandy wound up with, it was more of a coastal storm and it was wind. I mean, we only got, when everything was said and done, about 2 inches of rain.
No, I appreciate that, but
yeah.
still people flooded,
Oh yeah, it was mostly,
the coast flooded.
yeah,
So,
it was mostly coastal. It was mostly and Oriental for the most
but
part.
isn't that part of our purview?
To a certain extent, I mean, the difference between riverine and coastal flooding is that you can really protect yourself more against riverine in our case than coastal. I mean, a storm like Sandy is, I mean, we could have had, more significant protections and it would have been as impactful a storm as it was to begin with.
If you can put together 2012 in terms of flood damages, I don't know if you can or not. I think it would be interesting to see.
Yeah,
If
I
it's difficult
can,
to do, then we can't do it.
yeah,
What could we do to protect the village from a coastal storm? And I think the answer is probably close to 0. Whereas we can, have projects that will prevent future riverine flooding.
Yeah.
And that's,
But when you look at the FEMA grants for all those homes that were raised, including mine, the majority of them were along the coast.
yes, but that was still riverine flooding, Peggy.
No,
well,
they're beach houses and
No,
Yeah.
I mean, your house is riverine.
mine was, but most of the people who got grants were on the coast.
not in Mamaroneck though.
Not in Mamaroneck, I'm saying in general.
Yeah, in general, coastal flooding is is the bigger problem in this country.
Right.
Especially with hurricanes, climate change.
Sea levels rising.
Yes, that's where the focus is definitely going to be over the next 50 years. On
And that's mainly due to rising sea levels as
Yeah.
well as
And
storms.
severity of storms.
yeah, I mean, rising sea levels, warmer temperatures mean warmer water, which means more powerful hurricanes too.
Yeah.
So it's a vicious cycle. So item number 3.
Sounds like we're on hold till January.
I did reach out to Megan and let her know that we were resuming meetings. I did not hear back from her, but I didn't expect to. I reminded her that we've started meeting the 4th Tuesday every month and we'd love to have her. My guess is this won't happen until January, but the invitation was extended.
Okay, thank
Did
you.
you say Megan?
Her name is Megan.
Who are we talking about?
She's the woman from Senator Schumer's office who had
Okay.
talked to us after the 3 representatives wrote the letter asking for a meeting with the Army Corps.
Yeah, listen, the fact is we may be in a different position come January if there's a change in the leadership at both the executive and the Senate, which could definitely play to our benefit, especially on the Senate side. Item number 4, County Executive Latimer. The county executive is prone to attending meetings unannounced.
Right.
So, my guess is, if you invite him, he would try and make time. It's also possible that, as he's here right now, actually. So I'll allow him to talk if you don't mind.
No, that's hilarious.
I think the county executive
I
has
landed
perfect timing.
right on the runway.
Yes.
I don't want you to think for my friends here that my video is not on, huh? Okay, well, that's just as well, I suppose.
I can
Hi,
promote you.
George.
Actually, if you give me, I'll promote you to panelist. You may be able to turn your video on at that point. So, let's see. No, oh, here it goes. Yeah, you should be able to turn your video on now.
Got it, thank you. I look a lot better on voice only, but I just wanted to stop in, with Zoom now, what I would do normally back in the days, I'd go to 2 or 3 meetings as best as I could. Now I can do 8 meetings a night. And just to drop in and find out, what's happening, in this case with the Flood Mitigation Committee, what would you like me to work on here at the county? That would be helpful.
George, we were just literally talking about you and saying, one of the things on the agenda was, how do we want to ask County Executive Latimer who else should attend our meetings? And you just popped up like
Kismet. It's Kismet.
exactly. Well, we're concerned, I think, I speak for all of us, that it looks like the Army Corps project is certainly delayed.
Yeah.
It's still alive, and that we probably won't get much information out of Washington at least until January, or perhaps if there's a new administration.
Right.
So it seems like we're all kind of on hold. The question is, I would imagine there's not a lot of money kicking around the county this week looking for flood projects to do.
No. What was the, I remember that when we started this process, I was at the state level. And so we were looking for a different level of state compensation. So now at the county, what was the estimate of the project that the county needed to contribute in capital?
0.9 million, Dan? Something like that. It was under 10, because I remember you coming to a meeting and saying, we can get this by without having to do a referendum.
Right. In fact, the law's been changed, so we could actually do above 10, but if we can keep it under 10. As a capital project, it's a different kind of expenditure. Here's what I would suggest you do, and I guess you want to go through the village board to do this. So Kelly, and you'll discuss this with Dan and Jerry. Have the village, at the urging of the Flood Mitigation Committee, send us a letter to me and to Catherine Parker and just say, we are still holding out hope that we're going to be able to tackle the issue of flooding. We have a project that's been approved, and the county's contribution to that cause would be X million dollars. Put that in a letter to us, and then we'll respond We'll try to be as supportive as we can in the response. We know that if the feds don't come through, everything else is soup. But at least when you talk to the feds, then we're in a position to say, well, we've lined up. We know what the village can contribute. We've lined up the county. You know, obviously it's harder to line up the state. Were I a state legislator, it would be hard to get that kind of a commitment. But now that I'm the executive of the county, I can make a commitment like that, as long as I'm the executive of the county, which is not forever. So at least with a letter like that, you have something to work with. I don't know, have you met with a fellow by the name of Jamal Bowman, who won the primary? Apparently, he does not have a November opponent on the Republican line. I believe that's true. So one of the other things I suggest, besides writing a letter, is see if you can reach out to him. You know, he's very early in the process. He's running a campaign. He is not yet a congressman, but he's going to be the congressman that represents Mamaroneck and Larchmont and Rye and so forth. So it might be a good idea to bring him on board, have a meeting with him through the village. There's probably other village issues that you want to talk about with him, no doubt. But I definitely raise this because you'll want him to be knowledgeable and a fighter on behalf of this. I have met with him. He's a nice fellow. I endorsed the incumbent, Elliot Engel, but you know, once these things are over, we all work together and we try to do what we can do. So I think that would
Sorry,
be,
do you have contact for him by any chance?
Peggy, if you communicate with me to my email, latimergeorge@gmail, I'll give you the phone number, and then you can call him and then get the official number. He doesn't have an office or anything yet. It's premature because there's still an election at hand. But at least the earlier you make the contact, the earlier you bring him down, walk him through, show him everything there is to see, so that he can be an advocate for you. That would all be helpful.
Maybe he'd like to go on a river walk.
I think he'd love to. And I think if you make the outreach, you can suggest, say, George Latimer suggested I call you. So if he's mad or something, blame me. Throw me under the bus. No, he'll be fine. He'll be happy to outreach to you.
Thank you.
And if you do send me a letter along the lines that I've said, send it to Catherine Parker as well, since she's the legislator. And we'll respond with some kind of positive statement. Obviously, if we're going to do a multiple $1 million project like that, we'll try to finance it over a couple of years. If we can finance it over 2 years and do half and half, then it's a workable number at our level. Dana knows, she knows how we do these things. She saw me finagle in the Senate now. I'm doing finagling on a bigger level now, Dana.
It's cool to see you at work.
But look, we know the project is needed and we're going to be with the village. We're going to be alongside the village in trying to do it. And we hope that'll help. And maybe it'll help with the state. Then the state will be more likely to want to do it if the county is with the village on it,
Thank you.
You got it. Anything else you need me to do before I zoom off to my sixth one? You can imagine how many of these things I do at night like this. I'm still in the office. This is great. It's not great to have a pandemic. It's great to be able to go from meeting to meeting.
Exactly. Good to see you.
Okay. Well, I will bail out. Thank you for letting me in, and we'll have a chance to talk as we go forward.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Stay well, George.
See you all in person sooner or later.
God willing.
Okay. Let's hope. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, George.
We couldn't have made that up.
Yeah, he's apt to attend these meetings. So
The words were coming out of your mouth, and there he was.
Wherever more than 3 people congregate, there's George,
There's George.
by Zoom or in person.
Okay. Point 5, I have to say I didn't do my bit. I don't know if anybody else did to contact the different
Don't feel bad.
municipalities. Pardon?
Don't feel bad. Me
Good.
neither.
Thank you. So maybe we should try and do this for the next meeting,
Okay.
since we all had one.
But that still might be too soon. I mean, the village of Mamaroneck's offices are basically closed. You can't speak to somebody easily. So do we want to hold off for a little bit longer,
Why don't
or?
we try? Because I found just reaching out to building departments and assessors' offices, everybody's open, everybody's working, even if you can't go in.
But we didn't hear from Dana or Paul or Maria about whether they were able to get any
No,
contact or information.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do anything with it, but I
Right,
will
so we're on the same boat.
try.
Honestly, I completely forgot about it till I got your minutes.
Okay.
So if we're throwing ourselves on our swords. Okay, Dan, the Anita Lane Bridge should be done by now, right?
I actually got a call last week from the contractor about getting a crane permit so he could have his crane on the Valley Place side of the bridge. So I asked him to have someone get in touch with me so I could discuss where everything was. So the contractor is doing something at this point. I don't have a good enough description of what that is and what the schedule is, but it's obviously not forlorn. The project is not forlorn. So it'll be moving along.
I think we should jump on it before somebody realizes that they could pinch that money.
Yeah. Well, it's a bond issue. So, I mean, I think the money can only be used for that project, I believe.
If the county bonded it?
Yeah, it's a county project.
I didn't realize they bonded it. Okay.
I'm guessing they did. I think I'll take a look at the paperwork. I think they did.
Can you try reaching out to him again before we meet?
Yeah, I'll reach out to county DPW. Our former engineer works there now, so maybe he can let me know what's going on.
Thank you. Okay.
And other bridge projects. So we are, actually, I spoke to you about a separate subject with Hillside Bridge a couple of weeks ago.
I have a deal on the house.
Okay, well, that's good. We're on schedule to award a contract by the end of the year to begin the work. So that'll take place during calendar year 2021. I think we have to have the project completed by, I think, March 31 or June 30th of 2022. So we're on schedule for that. The Waverly Avenue Bridge, I think people have, is everyone familiar with some of the commentary that's gone on with that project?
Is there new, more recent stuff?
Well,
that's-
I mean, I think there's been, residents from Washingtonville are seeking to essentially have the bridge eliminated as opposed to replaced.
Yeah,
Or have it as a pedestrian only. I mean, I obviously I know Paul's plan for the bridge. He wants to channel Wile E. Coyote and
Actually, Dynamite Company.
yes. But there are some traffic studies, there was the traffic issues we're looking at. And I think the town is waiting for us to say, what is the village's preference?
So it's sort of on hold?
No, I mean, listen, they're still in the design process. They have a state grant, well, technically it's a federal grant like we have for the Hillside Bridge. So they're going through their process of finishing their final design report, going through all the studies they need to do as part of the process with the state. There's some question about whether it requires a consistency review from our local HCZM. The town classified as a type 2 action because it's replacing a bridge with a bridge, so no further environmental studies were required. I don't have any additional information other than that there has been some commentary from the local community asking that maybe a different direction is pursued with that bridge. I'm trying to be as kind as I can be with some of the terminology.
I have a question.
Yes.
Could you clarify, you said that Washingtonville said they wanted the Waverly Avenue Bridge.
The issue is that
who that is? Is that a
Washingtonville is,
organization or?
well, no, I mean, the Washingtonville neighborhood is the streets that directly surround Waverly Avenue Bridge. Is that the Alliance? No. The Washingtonville Housing Alliance that's a separate.
So it's Center Avenue, and it's Plaza, and it's
Yeah.
Waverly, and
There was different
Washington
residents
Street.
on those streets?
Yeah, what people commonly refer to as the flats
Right.
is what I refer to as Washingtonville.
right.
I don't use the term the flats myself.
Okay.
Good.
And if you've driven by in the last month or so, there is almost every house on the streets have signs saying, don't use as a cut through, use Floyd Avenue.
Yeah, I mean,
Right, so that has to do with the bridge? Because I've seen that on other streets also, those signs.
I think trustee,
What does that have to do with the
Right.
bridge? I was confused.
well, Deputy Mayor Wenstrup, I think, wants to make a comment.
So let me try to give some extra background here. We've been hearing from residents of Washingtonville, Center Street, Madison, that their neighborhood has become cut-throughs between Fenimore and Mamaroneck Avenue in both directions. So they would like to see the traffic cut. Ideally, they would like to see no traffic allowed over the Waverly Avenue Bridge into their neighborhood. They would like to see all the traffic diverted to Hoyt Avenue instead. As part of the bridge construction project, the bridge will be shut down at some point and traffic will be diverted to Hoyt Avenue. A stoplight will be put in front of the ice house to deal with the backlogs. And we're going to take that opportunity to see what happens. I mean, is the traffic pattern using Hoyt only sustainable? I don't know. We're going to look and we're going to see how that happens. Whether the bridge gets replaced, the bridge has to be replaced because we can't get fire trucks into and out of that area well without that bridge. So the fire department is also involved in those discussions, and they're going to need to have a good functioning bridge. The bridge is crumbling, and so it needs to be replaced anyway. We also believe that commercial traffic is not allowed as a cut through anyway on Waverly Avenue. That's an enforcement issue. That law is already in place. So we need to enforce that to help those residents with that traffic piece of the problem. So that's just a broader picture.
Well, this all goes back a good 30 years, when I first moved to Waverly Avenue. And Hoyt was expanded, widened, just for the purpose of taking traffic away from Washingtonville, the Waverly Avenue area. As a resident of that area, and I was active on the Washingtonville neighborhood program and all that, and also, in other venues, the Waverly Avenue Bridge is a horrible thing for flooding. The water backs up there because the river there, the Sheldrake, is too shallow and it's too narrow. And when you get water coming down, from up north, it can't, the Sheldrake can't handle it. And it hits the water rises, it hits that bridge and it backs up. It floods Waverly, its Center, Washington, and causes extreme damage and flooding. The last time we had a serious flood there was a damn refrigerator freezer stuck under that bridge. It had washed down from Lord only knows where, stuck there. Well, I don't know, Peggy, but it was stuck there. And of course, that prevented any water from getting through and exacerbated the flooding in the whole area.
Yeah.
So the residents of Washingtonville want that bridge out. They want done with the Waverly Avenue Bridge what was done with the Center Avenue Bridge. And I don't see logistically how you can make the bridge high enough, a new bridge, high enough to prevent flooding and still have an angle. In other words, you have to have an approach to the bridge from both directions. And if you have to raise the height of the bridge over the surface of the water, the angle increases. And you have to go maybe 3 or 4 houses into Waverly and 3 or 4, 100 feet back on Waverly towards Fenimore from the other side of the bridge. Otherwise, you're not going to do anything and you're just going to promote more flooding in the future. So I haven't spoken up this time, but Dan knows my feelings.
Yeah.
We all do, Paul. We've heard this.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, well, but it's true.
I know
And,
it's true. I know it's true.
just, the fire department says yes, they need, and they always say that, but I think they could find a way of getting trucks down there, or have just a bridge that, comes down like a drawbridge. In an emergency, it just flops down. Unless the fire trucks go through, then it comes back up. Meanwhile, people are using Hoyt, and actually Washingtonville becomes a separate community. And I think that's what they are looking for now, with all their signs saying, use Hoyt. That's what Hoyt was widened for. So I won't go on anymore. Yeah, you've heard my canned speech, but yeah, dynamite, Wile E. Coyote. I pass.
Okay.
Okay, so other bridges. Route 1. So we're looking at July 1 start date for that, July 1, 2020. I'm sorry, 2021. Hopefully after, assuming we'll be able to have a carnival and parade next year, after all the festivities are complete. Actually, there was just a press release from the governor on this, about the 3 projects. The Route 1 bridge is part of 3 bridges they're replacing. And thankfully, as confirmed by the governor, there will be traffic over the bridge while it's being replaced. So we won't have to worry about a shutdown of Post Road, which will be a tremendous benefit for us. So I think the press release was just from, might have been earlier this week, yesterday or last Friday.
How are they going to do that, Dan? They're going to do one side of the street and then the other?
I don't know. I haven't seen the final, what they call the maintenance protection of traffic plan, but that's probably what they're going to do. The biggest benefit for the village, there will be a flood benefit. They're going to reinforce the bottom of the bridge. But there's a tremendous pedestrian benefit for us in that there will be sidewalks on both sides of the bridge now. Right now, it's only on now it's the Chabad side of the bridge. The south side, people have to walk in the road if they want to walk over there.
Dan, a question for you. When you say they're going to reinforce the underside of the bridge, is there a way to make sure they don't do what they did on the Halsted Avenue Bridge when they lowered the span? Does that block more water than it did before that was replaced?
Well, I think I can't recall what the exact term was in the press release, but it will be, the underside of the bridge will be strengthened. They're not proposing to lower the court height of the bridge. I know that. I've seen that. So,
I just hate for it to all of a sudden be where we were when the county took care of the Halsted Avenue Bridge for us.
If I could make one more comment, Dan and Kelly, on Hoyt Avenue. I've heard the talk of putting a traffic light at the corner of Hoyt and Fenimore, but you've got, I think this was looked at before, and the DOT didn't like the idea because you're coming down Fenimore Road from Prospect. You're not going to be able to see that light.
Yeah, I don't know if they're going to put it on both sides of the train track. This is a town project and they had their traffic people looking at it as, knowing that there's going to be additional traffic coming onto Hoyt. Maybe they'd have a light on either side. I don't know.
Yeah, no, we've mentioned that. I mean, during our monthly meeting, I mentioned that the approach heading northbound, you're obscured by that train track. That's why we kept the stop sign at that intersection. That was only put up maybe 10 years ago as it was supposed to be a temporary sign while they were doing some improvements along that corridor. But after everything was said and done, we said, we looked at it as a staff and said, you have such a visual obstruction with that train bridge
Yeah.
that having that stop sign is a necessity.
You can't have an overhead light. 'Cause
Well, you have to have
people-
you'd have to have it, we talked about having something on the south side of that bridge for the northbound traffic. If that's confusing enough. I mean,
That's tough.
it's not the greatest. I'll leave it at that.
No.
It's something that I did bring up with the traffic engineers from HVEA. And
Maria?
I'm sorry, while we're back on the Waverly Avenue Bridge, is the residential comment period still ongoing on that, or is that closed?
that closed as of the end of last Friday.
Okay.
I think we received about 5 or 6 comments, very constructive comments though.
Okay.
And I think there were some of the people who commented during this time also commented during the initial period when the town had their presentation back in May.
Okay. The last point on the agenda, Dan, is the water testing that we've been asking for I'd say more than a year.
Yeah, so back in March, which feels like 7 years ago, after our flood committee meeting, I spoke to Peter Linderoth, who works for Save the Sound.
Yep.
He's a member of the Marine Education Center Advisory Committee. And when I discussed, testing up near the northern border, he was fine with that. Obviously, I haven't really followed up with him on that. I don't know what type of testing they've done this year, but I will speak to him and see if there's any opportunity to get anything done this
Thank
summer.
Okay. Okay. Does anybody else have anything before I move forward? Okay. I got a lengthy email from someone up in the Heights regarding the project, which we've all spoken about briefly in these meetings, 1602 Ellis, which is the vacant lot, which is right along the river, that's in the process of going through a very lengthy application to build. And I know that there's been tremendous change in the building department. And so my neighbors have been reaching out to the building department again and again and again and again. And they've spoken to a gentleman named Matthew on 6173720, just to get updates to find out what's happening, have all the proper tests been done, HEC-RAS, water flow, blah, 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 blah. And they keep being told nothing. Nobody knows.
So the Magnatas emailed me
Dan,
last week.
Dan,
What?
I was being very careful not to say
Okay. So the residents emailed me. Listen, the email is public information, but regardless, the residents emailed me. We received a building permit application a couple of weeks ago. I don't know.
no, in December, I thought.
No, that was for they were on a BAR agenda back in December, and the original request was, what was the process going to be, and I put together about a 3 or 4 page memo, which I think you and the neighbors received a copy of. I said something to the effect that they were going to have to do a SWIP, and they were going to have to show several items on their plan. When we received the initial application, I sent a copy of that memo that I prepared back in early January. I sent that to our consulting engineer, and I said, this is what I'm not asking you to do anything above and beyond what you normally do, but this is what we committed for the neighbors, what we said we were going to do. And I specifically asked him if on the application the floodway was shown. I asked him to make sure that was done. I don't think they did. I know that I don't know if he's given us his memo yet on the initial review. I have checked my email. I did respond to the residents that I wouldn't just give them documents as they come in, but they can certainly foil us for them and we make them available. Again, this is what we would ask of any resident who is seeking to find plans or anything like that. So, you know, I did get the email. When I first got the application, I was very deliberate in making sure
I
our
remember.
design engineer had everything that I sent you. And because that memo, when I prepared it, was reviewed by, you know, Hernani. It was reviewed by other members of the building department. I made sure that once we issued that memo, that everyone got a copy of it. And then we kept it in the building department file so that we knew that when something came in, we were gonna make sure that the concerns of the
Proper
residents
procedures
were,
are followed.
so I'm more than happy to, I'll find the email I sent to the residents back.
No, I
and
have it.
Oh, you
I-
do? Okay, so you have the copy. Okay.
I'll find that. I was questioning and then COVID hit and
Yeah.
never really got back to ask you. When I wanted to build, if you recall, and wanted to put the extension on the house, and we wanted to put 2 piers into the ground, we were told by the building department we had to do a HEC-RAS study specifically. And that was hugely expensive, and that's how we ended up cantilevering, because it was cheaper.
So
So I can't imagine why, if they're also building in proximity to the floodway, they wouldn't need to do the same study.
I'll review. I don't know if I said, I can't recall if I got the response memo from the engineer yet. But as I said, that if there was anything that called for it, we would probably ask them to complete that as part of the SWIP. I don't know if they're proposing to build, I guess, over the floodway like you did. I haven't, so, but
And the other thing we talked about was locating the garage on the riverside rather than putting the garage as the original. There must have been, no, there were plans submitted, Dan, because
no, they submitted plans as part of their,
as part of the BAR
for
thing.
the BAR.
So
And that's not what the
That's-
building plans are.
that's different. Okay, so that's my misunderstanding, sorry. But there was a comment made, why isn't the garage, which isn't habitable space, being put on the side of the river? And the residential living space that is habitable and will be on the ground put on the far side, so it would be less of a risk.
I'll review the original memo and letter. I honestly, I can't recall that, and not to say it wasn't there, I just can't remember if
I
it was
do.
in there.
Okay,
But I said, I think the memo I prepared back in January tried to address all of the comments that were raised by both you and
I think those were more
at the BAR.
flood stuff rather than design questions.
Okay,
I'll look back, but
Yeah.
but
But
that
that-
was something we were concerned about.
yeah, I mean, I was pretty sure to try and address all of those comments in that original memo.
I'll go back and have a look, but it still is something that is of concern.
Okay.
It just doesn't
Yeah.
make a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Big flood zone.
And I said, if you want to, if anyone wants to submit a foil on it, I'll make sure that
I will.
everything we have is
The
sent out.
other thing that is of concern on that lot is it has not been maintained by the owner. The grass is extremely high. There are all kinds of critters and potentially snakes kicking around in that property. And they've reached out to the what's the proper term? The person who gives the citations when you're out of compliance with stuff like that.
Yes, the code enforcement.
Code enforcer, thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask them to take a look at it tomorrow. I mean, unfortunately, it's actually a pretty high threshold, you know, both in terms of, I think you can have up to 10 inches high before we're allowed to cite on the
It's
state code.
really high.
It's about that, okay. So I'll ask
Thank you,
our code enforcer to take a look at it.
thank you. Okay. That's all I've got.
Okay,
Anybody else have anything?
Nice to see you all.
Thank you, nice to see you all.
Same here.
Dan, thank you for joining us. It's a big help when you're here.
Oh, thank you.
Kelly's great, but you have all the answers.
Yep.
So it's really good to have you with
Good to
us.
have Kismet fall in our lap with George attending exactly when I
That
said.
was unbelievable. Nobody would believe it unless they saw it on our Zoom. Without further ado, shall we call this meeting to an end?
You just need a motion to close and a vote.
I'll make a motion.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 They go a lot faster on Zoom.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan, I got one question for you.
Sure.
Library's gonna need, we're gonna have to put a crane, need a crane permit for a new cooling tower up on the roof.
Okay.
See you on that?
Me or the manager's office, but yeah, we'll make sure it gets taken care of.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll talk to you then.
Okay. You got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Stay well,
Yeah.
everyone.
Stay well.